Hi, this is Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, joined by Sheldon Richman, the foundation's vice president. This is the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day. And Sheldon, what's burning today is what's going on in Ukraine as well as really in Venezuela. We've got cases where there's chaos, there's crises going on. You've got different factors playing different roles in this. You got the old Cold War syndrome resurfacing. You've got the old confrontation between, the United States government and, well, it's not the Soviet government, it's the Russian government. And then you've got over in Venezuela the problems with socialism and that causes, but intertwined with that is the U.S. interventionism there. So it's a fascinating situation, and I think it provides a perfect opportunity to show how different libertarians are, how we would address these kind of crises as compared to what's going on today with the Obama administration and with status in general. What do you think?
Well, I agree with that. These are the kinds of crises that arise. As I said on Facebook this morning, when people are subject to the governmental habit. In other words, they look to government for everything. A lot of what's going on involved in the Ukraine is whether Ukraine should sign a trade agreement with the European Union, or whether Ukraine should basically sign a trade agreement with Russia. Why do they have to sign any trade agreement? Why can't people just trade? Period. We're so used to thinking of trade, even in the United States, in terms of government policy. And the U.S. has tons of bilateral trade agreements, multilateral trade agreements. They regulated trade from the very start of the country. Embargoes, all this stuff is imposed by states. Trade has never been left alone, to just be left to private individuals and private companies. So, I keep wondering, why does Ukraine, what does that even mean, Ukraine? Why does Ukraine have to sign an agreement with either bloc? So we have to stop thinking in governmental terms, in my opinion. That's what leads to these kinds of crises. Now, because once you have these disputes, then everybody brings their own particular interests and ideological concerns to it. So now you have, Putin wanting to not lose influence over Ukraine, not wanting to have it turn to be basically a member of NATO in effect, if not actually. And then, meanwhile, the U.S. and the EU are jockeying to maintain, their dominance as far as influence goes. And who knows? It could end up being an armed conflict. Now, I don't think there's going to be Russia versus the U.S. armed conflict. Hopefully, they're too sane for that. But people could die, and it will be innocent people, no doubt.
Yeah, that's a great point on trade, because it certainly applies to the United States as well. Here's the country that prides itself, as being the big paragon of freedom and free markets and capitalism and so forth. And it's all a joke. They've got the embargo against Cuba that puts Americans into jail if they travel to Cuba and spend money there. If that's not a violation of liberty, free markets, and basic decency, I don't know what is. And really, and you see this all across the board with the U.S. having, trade restrictions and tariffs on imported goods and managing all these trade agreements. Why didn't the U.S. government lead the world in terms of free trade, just unilaterally drop all restrictions on Americans to trade with people anywhere in the world? As Frederick Bastiat said, this is one of the keys to peace, that you depoliticize trade. And as you point out, that's what was going on with Ukraine and, wanting to trade with Europe. All they had to do was just drop their trade barriers. They don't have to negotiate anything. But I think it's also necessary to go to a deeper level here and at least focus on the role that the U.S. empire has played in all this. Because when the Cold War ended, while it resulted in the dismantling of the Soviet Union and the exit from the Eastern European countries of the Soviet Union, going back to Russia and liberating a lot of those countries that had been under Soviet occupation, nothing really changed with respect to the U.S. empire. Look at NATO. NATO was specifically designed, supposedly, to protect Europe from a Soviet invasion. And yet, Did they dismantle it once the Cold War ended? Of course not. Instead, what they started doing is maneuvering and finagling and really doing their best to keep pressuring Russia, garnering memberships of the former Eastern European countries that had been under Soviet domination. That's the indication also, that, at least from the Russian standpoint, that that's what they're going to be doing with Ukraine, so that the U.S. forces can be right there on Russia's border. I mean, if Russia had been doing this over here in Latin America, getting these countries in Latin America to join the Russian bloc or the socialist bloc or the communist bloc or whatever, darn well that there'd be U.S. invasions right now, because we saw those kind of invasions during the Cold War. And so, it's just another classic example of where this imperialist vision of this country that unfortunately didn't dismantle after the end of the Cold War is now contributing to a new crisis. We go from the war on terrorism back to the future with the Cold War. Just same old stuff. I mean, big military budgets, ongoing crises, same old stuff, Sheldon.
No, I agree. It's really bad what the U.S. did when the Soviet Union peacefully disbanded. Let's not forget. In a way that no conservative ever predicted, right? They figured either the Soviet Union was going to be around forever, or there'd be a final world war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, the nuclear war. In fact, it was quite peaceful implosion. During the administration of George H.W. Bush, the first George Bush, who had been head of the CIA and had held a lot of governmental positions, including vice president, he promised Gorbachev that if the Soviet Union in its dismantlement let go of East Germany and allowed it didn't stand in the way of a reunification of Germany, which worried Russia for historical reasons. But if they allowed that NATO would not expand. That was a promise overtly made to Gorbachev by Bush the first. This is reported by lots of people, but including Ray McGovern, who for 30 years was a CIA analyst and who daily briefed Vice President George Bush during the Reagan years on, the world situation. And he was a Russia specialist. That promise was then broken because, as you pointed out, all the Warsaw Pact nations were invited to join NATO, and they did. That's what used to be the Czechoslovakia, which peacefully broke into the Czech Republic and Slovakia, Poland, Hungary, etc. Then, in addition to that, the Baltic states, which were under Soviet domination, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, became members of NATO. Then Albania became a member of NATO. So that brought NATO up to Russia's doorstep, right to the doorstep, which is what they feared. Then talk began about bringing Ukraine and the Republic of Georgia into NATO. And that talk is being revived now that this thing is going on. McCain and others, or John McCain in the Senate, is calling for, incorporating Georgia and Ukraine into NATO, as if somehow that's going to help the situation. So while I don't want to say anything positive about Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, because I believe Russian leaders have been as imperial-minded, for many, many hundreds of years as American leaders have been since 1776 or earlier. So that I don't think anybody has clean hands on this in this regard. You can see why American policy has acted as if the Cold War never did end, and that the idea was to tighten the noose around Russia. They've also had various deals with some of the other former republics in Central Asia, and so you can see the nervousness of the Russians. But when I say that, it doesn't mean I approve of what Putin is doing, because he's escalating by getting permission to put military troops in Ukraine, not just Crimea, but in Ukraine. So it's a complex and nuanced situation, but the U.S. hands are not clean, as you say.
Yeah, it's interesting you use that phrase because in legal jargon, if a party comes into court with what are called unclean hands, he lacks standing to complain, and he'll be denied equitable relief in the courts because he doesn't come into court with clean hands. And I think the same applies in situations like this. You know, okay, the Russia has invaded the Crimea section of Ukraine. Well, the U.S. has been invading countries for decades. I mean, we can just go back to Iraq. Here was a country that never attacked the United States, never threatened to do so. If there was ever a clear-cut war of aggression, that's it. And yet, you know, where's the outrage or indignation among the mainstream press? We can look at Latin America. How many countries has the U.S. invaded? Grenada, Honduras, Mexico. It goes on and on. And you know, what was the excuse? When Reagan invaded Grenada, to protect American citizens. It was a sham, just like Putin's, the same excuse Putin is using. But notice that, you know, there's all this outrage and condemnation against Putin using a ridiculous excuse, but not against the U.S. for doing the same thing. And I think what's good about the situation that's happening over there is it makes us realize how the national security state moved us in the direction of a Soviet Union or a Russia, where the U.S. is out invading countries and occupying countries, and that this was really no part of the founding principles of this country, Shelton. And I think that's one of the main distinguishing characteristics of libertarians versus statists, is that we believe in the founding principles of non-intervention, where, you know, it was best demonstrated by John Quincy Adams' speech to Congress on the 4th of July. I think it was 1821. Where he said, America does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. Yes, there's dictators. Yes, there's bad things that happen overseas. Yeah, there's wars. Yeah, there's conflicts. Yes, there's invasions. But America is not going to send its armed forces to fix these things, to police the world. Instead, we're going to create a model society of freedom and prosperity here. We're going to have sanctuary in case people want to flee the tyranny or the famines or the starvations or the wars. But other than that, well, we're going to wish the world well, but we're going to spend our time being the exemplar for freedom and prosperity. And I think that is one of the big differences between us libertarians and all these neocons and other statists that are calling for all these sanctions and punishments and interventions and G8 evictions. What a bunch of nonsense.
Yeah, I think unfortunately Adams' words were more honored in the breach than in the observance. And if you look at the real conduct of the U.S. government throughout its history, it's not so clean. But that aside, what's going on in Ukraine is very important to understand that it's not the sort of situation where you can clearly side with one contending force or the other. There are kleptocrats and oligarchs on both or all sides. I'm assuming if he said both, it means only two. There may be more than two. But on all sides. I mean, that country's been looted since the Soviet Union disbanded and it became an independent country. Under the guy who just left, who was Russian-leaning, as I read many times, his son, a dentist, became the richest man in Ukraine during his father's regime. Workers were treated pretty poorly under that regime. And the people that are now in control also have ties to, the big gas concern there and again, kleptocrats and oligarchs. So it's a very bad situation to be in if you're a citizen with good old liberal or libertarian sensibilities, because you don't want to choose between these two. And that again calls for nuance. Unfortunately, people assume that if you put down one side, that implies sympathy with the other side, and that's an incorrect inference. You may well be putting down opposing both sides. So people should not assume that if you criticize Obama, you're sympathetic to Putin, or if you criticize Putin, you're sympathetic to Obama. I say a plague on both their houses.
Yeah, that's a great word, kleptocracy. I remember when I first saw that word, I thought, wow, what a great word. And it means the government of the worst, I think. It's an awesome word. And yeah, it describes many.
The government of thieves.
Government of thieves, okay. Well, that describes most of the governments, not all the governments in the world. And for us to kind of look down our noses at some of these regimes and say, oh, we're better than you, or we know who would be the best people to put into office is really one of the reasons why people hate the U.S. government around the world, is that arrogance, that conceit that we know best for you. And it also exposes this whole democracy business, where the U.S. says we invade countries to spread democracy. We're willing to sacrifice U.S. troops. We're willing to kill as many Iraqis as necessary to bring democracy. Well, here was a democratically elected regime. And because the guy succumbed to pressure from the Russians and didn't go through the with the trade agreement, all these protests start rising up. But let's face it, a lot of those protesters are undoubtedly funded by the CIA and the State Department. They call it, encouraging democracy, where they funnel the money into a, quote, pro-democracy group. And they do this. They do it in Venezuela, which we'll talk about in a minute. They do it all over the world, when it's really just an excuse to oust the person from power that they don't want in power. I mean, their mindset, Sheldon, the way I look at it is, like Obama wants to get as many Democrats as possible in the governorships across this country. He's not satisfied. His party's not satisfied to have the presidency. They want to have all the governorships too. That's the way they view the world. They want to put their people in office all across the world. And so, our position as libertarians is leave it to the people of Ukraine to resolve this. If there's a revolution because there's a democratically elected tyrant, leave it to them to decide. If Russia gets involved, leave them alone anyway. Butt out of the world's businesses. And my model is Switzerland. Notice in Switzerland, they're not angsting over this and pacing the floors and saying, well, we've now got another Cold War crisis and the Russians are coming and the communists are coming. They just mind their own business. They go quietly about their business and nobody jacks with them because they've got the best armed, best trained citizenry in the world. Their foreign policy really is what America used to be all about. Not perfectly, as you point out, but in terms of what the intent and the spirit was when this country was founded, it was butt out of foreign affairs. And that's the kind of foreign policy we need now, instead of this constant crisis, which of course means bigger and bigger budgets for the military, the CIA, the NSA. I mean, it's just a repeat of the Cold War and the war on terrorism. Now they got the best of all worlds, Sheldon. They got the war on terrorism and now the communist threat, the Russian threat. And then they're starting to stir things up in Asia, where we're going to be facing the China threat and the Korea threat. I mean, what a bunch of nonsense.
Yeah, what makes me nervous on top of the events going on there is the fact that everybody, so many people from the Wall Street Journal to the Washington Post to John McCain to Lindsey Graham to Mike Rogers in the House are goading Obama, saying all this is happening because of his retreat from the world. Now, it's a joke that there's been any retreat from the world. Just look around. Just look what the U.S. is doing in so many places. So there's no retreat. But they're goading him, and I would hate to think that he would sort of, out of weakness, give in to those voices and think he needs to show a more forceful response to what Russia is up to. And that's where things could get dangerous. Nobody really wanted World War I either, but it was the kind of thing where people started taking steps to counter each other, leaders in Russia, in Germany, in France, mobilizing, taking a step here, then countering the step there. And before you know it, it's like a snowball rolling downhill. And despite the fact that nobody really wanted it, it was happening. And then we have the terrible catastrophe of World War I, which changed that century so profoundly for the worse, and we're still living with headaches. In fact, this is what we're experiencing today in Ukraine. You could trace back to that. This is what makes me nervous, that all these people are telling Obama that he's weak, that he's naive, that he's playing marbles while Putin is playing chess, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Will Obama show some backbone for a change and say, I don't care what you people say, we're not going to war with Russia?
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, there could easily be a miscalculation over there. The Ukrainian soldier starts shooting at a Russian soldier, and all of a sudden everything just breaks loose in an all-out war there. And then who knows what the U.S. is going to do at that point. They've already pledged $1 billion of assistance to this new regime. That's incredible to me from a financial standpoint. I mean, didn't we just go through another debt ceiling debate where they said, well, we have to raise, yeah?
There are loan guarantees, just for the record. There are loan guarantees, but that will divert money to Ukraine that otherwise would have gone somewhere else.
Oh, absolutely. And you know, when you make a loan guarantee, you know, that may come due. And so here you have this busted government that's got this huge debt ceiling that's signing loan guarantees for people to the tune of $1 billion. What's that all about? And I'm not so convinced that the U.S. is disappointed with this Russian intervention. You know, at least the people in the parallel state, the CIA, the NSA, and so forth. I mean, I can't help but remember what happened when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. When Brzezinski, Carter's national security advisor, says, this is fantastic, we're now going to give them their Vietnam. And when he was challenged on this and said, well, can't there be Islamic terrorists, fundamentalists, you know, rising up as a result of this? He says, what do we have to worry about a few Islamic terrorists about? And of course, then you had people like Osama bin Laden, and we learned what there was to worry about later on 9/11. And so, you know, I just wonder whether some of these people aren't saying, oh, this is great, man. The Russians have been lured to another, you know, occupation like Afghanistan. Let me shift gears a little bit on Venezuela, though. You know, situation there is interesting also from a libertarian perspective. I mean, here you have this dyed-in-the-wool socialist, you know, Chavez's successor, Maduro, and he's thrown the country into chaos with his socialist policies, price controls, inflation, and so forth. But at the same time, and obviously people are very, very dissatisfied. But at the same time, Sheldon, you have the prospect that the U.S. is in there covertly fomenting a lot of the crisis. They've done that before. That's their modus. They did it when they were trying to oust Allende from power. The CIA was in there paying workers, truckers to strike. And they had a huge food strike, and Nixon had told the CIA, make the economy scream there so that we could get General Pinochet to take over in a coup. So you never really know what the CIA's role is in these things. I mean, this is their modus. And so it puts the libertarian in a very awkward position because, as you say, we want to oppose U.S. interventionism in Venezuela, but the last thing we want is any kind of perception that we're supporting this socialist, democratically elected dictator. I mean, here's another case where you have a democracy ending up with a guy who's really destroying the country with his economic policies, not to mention the fact that he's shooting protesters and killing people and so forth. I think we have to make our stand real clear. The U.S. should butt out and leave Venezuela to the Venezuelans.
Well, agreed. And, you point to the problem, again, of nuance. People see things in a bipolar way. So if you criticize one side, that you must therefore be in favor of the other side. And that's we got to fight that. This is the sad legacy of U.S. intervention around the world, particularly in Latin America in this case, because so often opposition to a left state socialist regime was fueled by the CIA, in later years the National Endowment for Democracy, and other government agencies or U.S. government-related organizations that helped to foment unrest in the street and other kinds of problems, which could have the effect of driving a regime out of power. So you have people maybe sympathetic to the incumbent regime, even though they don't really like it, purely because they think the alternative are oligarchs backed by American banks or something like that. And if we were in their place, I don't know how certain we can be that we wouldn't also be supporting the regime just as an expediency, because the alternative is so-called what they call neoliberalism, namely ruled by the World Bank and the U.S. banks and the International Monetary Fund and American leaders. If that's the choice, it's not so easy which one you pick. Now, we know what the best choice would be. It would be a free society with free trade and individual property rights and no government privileges whatsoever. but that's not what they're facing. So, you and I and people like us, we have to condemn both sides. But we have a little extra responsibility, I think, regarding the U.S. government, because it's the one that takes our money, sends our money off to intervene. And I think we need to be seen around the world as speaking out against, quote, our government's intervention.
Yeah, I'm really glad you pointed that out about the regimes that the U.S. supports down there, because the U.S. government likes to make it look like, oh, they're just standing for freedom, and they want Maduro out because, he's against freedom. And the classic example of this was Cuba. I mean, here you had this brutal dictator that was pro-U.S., Batista, looting and plundering people and jailing people and so forth. I mean, he's a classic dictator. And so you could sympathize with the Cuban people. And so somebody comes along like Castro and says, we want to oust this dictatorship. Your inclination would be, hey, fantastic. And then he gets into power and turns out to be just as bad as Batista. And the U.S. there says, oh, well, we need to go assassinate him, and we need to get rid of him, we need to invade. Not because they favor any kind of free society for the Cubans as we do, as we libertarians do, but so that they can put their own dictator in and back in like a Batista again. And we saw this time and time again in Latin America, where they would oust democratically elected people that, certainly were no libertarians. They were like socialist Arbans, communist oriented, but they replaced him with a brutal military dictator, and that's the history of U.S. interventionism. For some reason, they love military dictators. I mean, they like dictators in general, like the Shah of Iran, who they installed after ousting Mossadegh, but they seem to favor military dictatorships, like the one in Egypt right now that ousted Morsi, Pinochet. Guatemala, they installed a succession of military dictators. And I think you're right that we've got to make it real clear that while we libertarians oppose what's going on in these countries that are, run by socialist dictators or people that are violating human rights like Pinochet was doing, that what we favor is a free society, not what the U.S. government favors, which is the installation of a pro-U.S. dictator.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we need to do. And it may be hard to get our voices heard, but we need to write and speak and do things like this program to get this word out and influence other people who will then pass this along and extend it themselves. And, maybe it will find its way to the American people en masse, and they'll demand that the government just cut it out and stop trying to orchestrate events. This idea that the U.S. can manage affairs around the world is ridiculous. It won't be able to manage Ukraine. It may be able to make some changes at the margin, but it's not going to manage it no more than Russia can manage it. And the same thing goes with Venezuela. It's hubris for these politicians to think they can do this. They can't even manage American society or the American economy, where presumably they understand the culture a little better. But then they blunder into these places where they seem to show no sign of even understanding the local situation, the culture, the local problems. I mean, time after time, it's been exposed how ignorant they are, how clumsy they are when they come in and offer a solution which is totally irrelevant to the real people who live there day to day. So, when will they get over this? They have no incentive to get over it because it yields power, prestige, and in many cases wealth to them. So why do we expect them to ever learn otherwise?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, look at the messes they've made in Iraq and Afghanistan, Vietnam. I mean, the list just goes on. And here they are saying, we're going to fix things in Ukraine. I mean, all they're going to do is, it's such a conceit that they really believe that despite all these messes they've done, that this was going to turn out okay. I mean, how ridiculous is that? And really, we'll wrap up just by talking about the beauty of the libertarian paradigm is dismantle this entire empire, this national security state. It has wrought nothing but destruction and death to American soldiers, to people of the world. And imagine how much better life would be where Americans are sitting here at home building a free society, letting America be a sanctuary for people that are suffering under here. I mean, that's what America was all about in the beginning, is that if you're suffering tyranny, oppression, or starvation around the world, or war, here's a place where you can come and nobody's going to turn you back. And, I mean, to me, what a beautiful vision that is, where you don't have a militarist society with policing the world and foreign aid and interventionism and getting embroiled in other people's fights and disputes. In other words, just building a free society here at home, a prosperous society, because this whole warfare state machine that thrives off these crises sucks more and more money out of the private sector. And so you have this warfare state combined with a welfare state that's really taking our country down financially and economically. So the only real solution is libertarianism. I mean, that's the way that gets us to peace, prosperity, harmony, and most important, to a free society. So that's the show. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.